Greg, good afternoon to you and happy Christmas as we approach the last podcast of the year.
Ho, ho, ho. Merry Christmas to you too.
Yeah, if only it was though, and I think it feels like a really good chance to reflect. We've been clearly looking at specific issues of air and space power over the last 6 months or so. But it's been incredibly busy in the media over the last week or so, particularly looking at Ukraine. And I think it's worth stepping back a little bit and looking at where we are with that because we're about to enter the fifth year of that conflict. With Ukraine on the back foot, NATO looking a bit wobbly, America looking increasingly like it's worried about itself rather than worried about its global responsibilities, and Europe looking increasingly short of ideas. And if I was an advisor to Putin, I think I'd be very happy with where we are. But how did we get here? How on earth did we find ourselves in this situation when NATO was the single most powerful military organization on this planet?
Yeah, and it's worth just looking back to work out how the hell did we get here? Because it is somewhat frightening that something that you and I have basically had as the bedrock of defense for this country and the continent, and a relationship with the US that was as solid as it could be, has so quickly turned into something far less solid. Now, you could argue the signs were there. We have been reminded, shall we say, particularly by American cousins, about spending and levels of effort. And we knew Trump's position. He was pretty vociferous the first time round. So maybe we shouldn't have been surprised. So maybe more fool us than this has been done to us. We just saw it coming and did nothing about it.
No, you must get bantered a bit about this on some of the media work you do, as I do, and part of it is I think for 80 years NATO's been the sort of bedrock, a US-led NATO, but of course the Cold War ended, everybody relaxed, and European defence spending has dropped significantly. Ours has halved, and a lot of European countries have dropped even more. America kept theirs largely around that sort of 4.5% level, and that's increased the friction between America that's sort of gone, you guys are doing wars of choice. You're not looking after your home security. We're now the biggest, partner in this, and we're providing your European security. All of a sudden, then Ukraine flares up, which it's not a member of NATO. It's on the European continent, and you can see why America, Trump particularly, would go, hang on a minute. This is on the European continent. It's a European problem. Come up with a European solution to it. And all of a sudden, we're not the United States of Europe over here. I know it might look like that from the American side, but it's a bunch of
Yeah,
different countries, different priorities, different languages, you sort of sense that there's four powerhouses, I think, in Europe, UK, France, Germany increasingly, and Poland. And you sort of wonder, how are we going to galvanize? Because together, that's an incredibly strong partnership. Fragmented, Russia wins.
yeah. It's hard to see here whether Ukraine accelerated this or merely became the catalyst that forced us into this decision. Otherwise, we'd still be arguing about a few percentage points here or there. I'd love to be a fly on the wall. I wouldn't love to be a fly on the wall in Putin's office, but if we had got inside his head, you know, has this been his plan all along? And we've merely accelerated it or created it through a variety of different ways. And you have to argue that yes, we probably are exactly where Putin wants us, dislocated, no longer as unified as we have been. America now beginning to cast itself adrift from Europe. This is Putin's Christmases all at once. The real question for me, and I'm an eternal optimist on these things, Sean, I always see the good in any opportunity, as bad as that might be sometimes. This is the opportunity for Europe to stand up and fix some things that it's been ignoring for too long. One is the spending, but also the organisation. And I know we in the UK have viewed European military ventures through a slightly weird lens. We don't like the EU side of things. In fact, even when we were in the EU, we were quite nervous about EU initiatives on military. But actually, there is now a fundamental question about, well, what does NATO look like without a strong America in it? Is it a Europeanized NATO? or is it a stronger EU body that has non-EU nations in it, like the UK, Canada? Or is it a model that looks at things like the GEF and scales those up and then becomes multiple coalitions that are willing? Because I think as bad as it will be that we lose some of the American hardware, what we also will lose is some of that organizational structure and the underpinning of it by comms networks, iStar, etc. So there's a much bigger challenge here than just upping our spending. We've got to recreate or redesign or backfill. Not sure which one of those three options is the right one. NATO to be stronger as a European venture.
No, I sort of get it, but you know, there's people who turn around and say, "Well, does this mean it's the end of NATO?" I'm not sure that's true. But in a way, it's been an advantage having a US-led NATO because it is the most powerful nation in the world. I think you've said before, you know, we back them up as long as we put 10% of the forces in. Can we have the deputy commander slot as the UK? And you go, we've almost played to this sense that they are the global police force. If you're now looking at some sort of European venture, how on earth do you get agreement where everybody's got their own priorities? We can't individually afford to have all the golf clubs in our golf bag. America can. So if we're going to go onto a golf course, do we in Europe all have different clubs and we pay for different levels of capability and then all get together? That leaves us individually vulnerable but collectively very strong. Do we all try to increase spending and capability to the level of America? Not a hope in hell. So I'm just not clear what that looks like if America, unless we just play America long, unless we play Trump long.
I think you're right. I think to just throw away NATO as if it's done would be a huge mistake. I'm not even sure America actually mean that in their national security strategy, but boy, does it smell like it. Because we may return to a different political situation. But if it can change this fast in literally less than a year, in basically a year, then maybe we do need to be wary of how secure that is in the longer term. But I think your fundamental question is correct, is we have been so used to America leading everything and being big brother, of which all of us tag along behind, and maybe we vie with the French to be the second in command on things, which is the way it's been. But now we're seeing powerhouses grow in particularly Germany, and you're right about Poland in terms of sheer size and mass of its army. So how do we lead now this new NATO when it's not America that's there first and foremost? This is going to be, the conversations that now should be happening in European capitals, and they do seem to get on. That's the good thing. So the key characters are unified. And if Putin has done us one favor, he's created the situation that we can't ignore. And therefore, we can't just fudge this and push it off for another 5 years of debate. We need to create something now.
Yeah, but so we can probably agree to disagree about the role of NATO in this, but bluntly, Ukraine isn't in NATO, and therefore, while we're talking about Ukraine, and that seems to be the hotspot which has the potential to grow into something significantly more dangerous, how on earth do we bring the war to an end? Because if the conversation is started with NATO, America's solution seems to be, according to a 28-point plan, is basically surrender. And that has all sorts of profound implications for Ukraine and therefore European security. The Berlin talks that were happening this week felt like as much about keeping America engaged as about finding a solution. And tellingly, even though people say, "Oh no, we're 90% of the way there," Putin wasn't there, and MI6 only said this week, there's no evidence whatsoever that Putin's actually engaging. So how do we bring this war in Ukraine to an end?
I think there's a couple of issues in there. One is I think the UK in particular are still hoping above all hopes that America doesn't mean everything that it's said, and that we can still hold them in. We can still rely on them for certain things, certain guarantees, certain enablers, nuclear backup, etc. And therefore, we don't want to cut the umbilical. I think a lot of other European nations have, to all intents purposes, cut the umbilical, said, right, we're not going to rely on an American support network. We will now look after ourselves. The UK is still a little bit on the fence, I think. So there's that element that's at play here. I think when we talk maybe about defence investment, I think that plays into that as well. I still think we think that Big Brother's going to be there to a degree. The other thing that I find surreal is that we've got America telling us Europe, it's your problem, and yet they're the ones driving the conversation on the solution in Ukraine, which is hugely frustrating, especially since it doesn't look like one that Europe really would accept or like, let alone what Ukraine thinks about it. And I don't laugh, but I certainly smile when there's this talk of an Article 5 like guarantee from America. Well, is this the same America, by the way, that's about to pull all its troops out of Europe and has told Europe to look after itself? So where does that promise land?
Yeah, but we also seem, I mean, it feels like we're doing a lot of talking in Europe, whereas Russia's doing a lot of action. There's a lovely quote somebody gave me the other day that said, soldiers win battles, but nations win wars. Because it's a whole of nation impact is getting the factories, defense industrial base. Putin's got, I think, 7% now GDP being spent on defense, 40% of government spending. He's got on a war footing. He's generating and buying in the bullets, the guns, the missiles, all of this stuff that's necessary. Meanwhile, Europe is struggling to provide that. If America's distancing itself, that's making it more difficult. The war of attrition is one that the bigger side can win. I mean, Russia seems, I was reading a story the other day about Africans being duped into joining the Russian military, salary of £1,500 a month, which is a fortune for them, just driving trucks in the rear area. They get out there and they're immediately put on the front line, killed. And you sort of go, how tragic. I just wonder whether, what's Russia? I mean, part of this, we can't change the past. What we can do is change the future. Is Russia, do you think, still set on subjugating the whole of Ukraine? Or do you think it's focused on the Donbass? Do you think it might, if the Donbass was ceded, be prepared to draw a line there? Or do you think, I mean, unless we know what that is, it feels very difficult to work out how we put pressure on Putin to bring him to the table.
Well, I think Putin played his hand with the invasion at the very beginning. And although Crimea obviously was long before that in 2014, but in 2022, he wasn't going for the Donbass. He was going for Kiev. So I think his objective has always been and probably will continue to be the entire subjugation of Ukraine. Certainly a lot of the rhetoric plays to that. Will he accept a halfway house for now? Maybe. Well, of course, he doesn't seem to be in terms of some of the negotiations, but he is rather fixated on the Donbass as an example. But it would only be as a stepping stone to go the whole way in the next 5, 10, 15 years, however long Putin can stay alive for. So, yeah, I think that it's a fool's errand if we think there's some sort of halfway settlement that gives away a bit of Ukraine, which is why I completely understand why Ukraine are hugely reluctant to cede any of that territory.
So if that's the case, and I'm absolutely with you on that, then what should Ukraine do now? It can't win an attritional battle on the front line. Making Russia pay for every step forward it takes seems to be relatively effective, but it's not a long-term strategy. It does seem to have had some impact by targeting Russian energy infrastructure, particularly with long-range weapons, because that's what Russia's using to fund the war, and also understand now that there are fuel and gas shortages in Russia, which of course means that it brings an element of hardship to the people there. So, I mean, I note that, was it President Trump was going to give Tomahawk missiles, or at least considering it. Putin immediately called him, and 3-hour conversation later, for some reason, Trump decided not to do it. Is there some way that, what's Ukraine's strategy in the next 6 months to a year? What should they do to force Putin's hand? And I think you and I have talked before. I firmly do not believe that Putin will stop because he wants to negotiate. I think he'll either stop because he's achieved his objectives, or he's forced to stop. And I think if the Europeans are going to be serious about this, we've got to talk about getting some proper weapons in the hands of the Ukrainians. We've got to look at no-fly zones, and we've got to look at potentially some other ways to turn the dial on Putin to make it halt, and therefore force him to the negotiating table.
Yeah, it's such a difficult problem to solve this if you just view it through a Ukrainian lens. I think Ukraine has to decide whether it wants to play with America anymore or not. I'm amazed, actually, that Zelensky has kept his patience, because he is still trying to play a canny political game with Trump by trying to acquiesce to things like elections, as long as it's security, etc. So he's trying to keep America and Trump on side because he recognizes that maybe that's the only way of a negotiated peace settlement. The problem is, I bet you behind closed doors, he's going, I don't trust them as far as I can throw them. And so the real question here is not what can Ukraine do? I think they're doing everything they can possibly do, but it probably wouldn't be enough in isolation. The fundamental question now is, what does Europe do? And, how big a step up is that? Europe's already struggling with the idea of defending Europe on its own without America. The idea, therefore, that it now wants to get engaged more closely in Ukraine and therefore directly come into conflict with Russia is a huge step, but it is really hard to see how we can get there without that level of engagement, whether that be no-fly zone initially or whatever it might be. And I know we talked long and hard about the misnomer of no-fly zone, but whether we need to be providing now a greater level of effort and make Russia realize money, economic leverage. We're still talking about sanctions that we've got left in the cupboard. We'll get them all out. Why are we still talking about? I mean, Europe still can't agree what to do with the money. I mean, I think they've come up with a fudge solution. So we've got to start playing hardball, and we haven't been playing hardball because Russia has to realize that it's too costly. And at the moment, Putin can absorb what he's doing. He's not under pressure at home. He doesn't appear to be. He's got a population that either are subjugated or are prepared to listen to what he's telling them. So, yeah, Ukraine is in a very difficult position here, and America is not helping right now.
Well, yeah, but I also think let's look at now what the impact that would be on the UK, because you and I have lived through a few defence reviews, haven't we, in our time? And when the new government came in, Ukraine's at war, implications for the UK are significant. And all of a sudden you went, what's the SDR going to do? It painted a really interesting vision for the next decade. But vision without funding is hallucination. It's one of those, it's all about the money. The defence investment plan, the DIP, was meant to be completed and out by, I think it was end of autumn. I've seen no sign of it. I don't know if you have yet.
But the leaves are still on my trees. So you could argue
it's you could argue, okay, maybe. No, it's pretty significantly winter when I look out the window here. But there's no sign of it. And I think the most recent, the Treasury, when it did its most recent budget, it prioritised welfare, lifting the 2-child cap and stuff like that, over increasing spending on defence. And I think we're getting that sense at the moment that there's a dichotomy. The government talked about making defence the foundation of growth for this country because there's going to be globally a lot more money spent on defence. And yet, where's the spark? Where's the start of that journey? And I think just this week we've seen the Chief of the Defence Staff in Rusi. You and I both know Sir Richard well. I've never heard that sort of language used by a serving military. And you and I regularly touch base with some of the other military chiefs, certainly the Chief of the Air Staff and others. And I definitely sense a growing sense of frustration at the moment about there is a threat out there. Why is nobody listening?
Yeah, and it wasn't in isolation either, was it? It was Al Cairns did one just prior where he talked about the need to step up and it being a national endeavour. Then we had the head of MI6 speak about the Russian threat in some pretty specific terms, which again, we haven't really done in isolation. It's singling out a country like Russia. We've now got the government doing an independent review into Russian interference in politics, democracy, long overdue. So yeah, there is a concerted effort here, because those things don't happen in isolation. Those three individuals didn't. Oh, I think I'll do a speech. Those were cleared and coordinated. So the government has accepted that there needs to be a wake-up call, and it's trying to wake up society. It's trying to wake up the nation to the idea that this threat is real, and that the things that we witness in Ukraine on a daily basis could happen in the UK.
I think that's why he talked about sacrifice, because Rich talked a bit about sacrifice. I don't think he was necessarily just talking about,
No, I don't think he was, and it's. I think the real challenge here is, at one hand, government's telling us all to wake up, but we're all looking at the government going, all right, then wake up, so why aren't you throwing more money at it? Or why aren't we seeing action? So there's a massive disconnect there, which I think is a fair thing to highlight. We know, of course, the fiscal current situation that the government finds itself. So there isn't a magic money tree, and quite frankly, 2-child benefit cap isn't going to fix defence overnight either. So it is more substantial than that. I think we did have Patrick Sanders talk about conscription not that long ago, and was slightly put back on the naughty step for doing it, and yet he probably was cleared to say that. But yeah, I think it is right that we wake the nation up to the threat. We probably should have done it a long time ago, because the nation isn't listening. If you Google, the top 10 things in the UK that people worry about, defence is quite low down. But when you listen to MPs, they say when they go on the doorstep, they are actually hearing people now saying, should I be worried about Russia? As opposed to my energy bills are really high. They probably start with that, but they very quickly then go, and what about Russia? So there is a consciousness starting to be raised in the country. Is government playing a long game here where eventually they'll think the people will go, yeah, let's spend 3%, 4%, 5%. Now, to be fair to government, they have scheduled in a payment up to those figures, albeit over the next 10 years. So are they trying to warm us up for more money in defence? Well, okay, maybe, but it's on a very low heat. And I'm not sure where are they trying this conversation to go?
Yeah, but that's where I'm a bit more passionate about this. I think it's easy for a government to say in 10 years' time we're going to do this. They may not be in power. They leave an inheritance for the next guys in. 3.5% of GDP, 5% of GDP, those are the figures. It's virtually a tripling of defence spending if you look at the actual numbers. It's eye-watering, and, yes, would the nation be ready to take that money just yet? But there is this sense that President Trump's going to be in office for another 3 years or so. And I've heard far too many of the senior folks talk, yeah, we'll play him long, we'll put these promises in because it shows that we're keeping him on side. But when he falls out of power, we won't actually be spending that money and we'll still have choices. And I just wonder, the harsh reality at the moment is we're seeing programs like Ajax. There is lots of, I've not seen any green shoots of recovery of this new investment plan, how we're going to get the all of those weapons stockpiles restocked. What's the plan? What's the simple plan? How are we going to energize this nation? The intelligence, all of the universities. There is just so much there that we have huge potential, but it's just not started. And the war rages on. Meanwhile, Putin gets more and more emboldened, and I just see this increasing disconnect. And do the politicians actually get it, or do they simply go, there's never been votes in defence, we'll tip our head, we'll make the large numbers, but frankly we're going to continue ploughing as we are at the moment?
I think they get it intellectually. I genuinely do. I just don't think they can square the numbers. They cannot find the headroom, and because they are worried about being re-elected, and if they were to suddenly commit the amount of money that they'd need to commit over the next 2-3 years, let's say, it would take a huge chunk out of some of those Labour ambitions.
We're not the only nation, are we? I mean, the rest of Europe. I was chatting to somebody the other day who said that Germany, their chief of their air staff, I think it was, they were talking about stockpiles, and they said, well, how much have you got to spend? And he said, I've been told to keep spending. They'll tell me when to stop. Now, no European country has got excess of money available, but it's choices, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think there are countries in Europe now, but Poland, clearly they're close. They feel the heat more than this. Yeah. But this isn't a new problem. We've all got big debts. The question is, where do you prioritise?
I was in Germany 2 weeks ago, and conscription is now alive and kicking, and they are reopening up Cold War sites that had previously been shut down. Rheindahlen being one, I was near there, where they are now putting back some of the infrastructure that we had there in the 80s, 90s. So there are things happening in Germany. When we talk about barracks being repossessed, we're talking about putting migrants in them. So, yeah, there is a huge disconnect. And is it because the UK sits a bit safer on its island? I think that's clearly a falsehood. Is it because we just can't afford it? Or is it because we don't believe America is really cutting us adrift? And I worry there's a bit of all of that. And we just can't make the bold choice that we all believe we should make, and that the SDR pretty much said that too. And nothing has changed since the SDR was written to make us feel safer. And those 3 speeches this week or last week, were clearly saying all the things that previously we've ducked. I mean, it's somewhat ironic, of course, that a lot of the politicians that then criticise the current government are the ones that took the money away for the last 15 years. So they all should look at themselves here, because as you and I know, this is not a problem that occurred overnight. This is a problem that we created 10, 15 years ago and underinvested without seeing the threat that was still out there. And now it's come home to roost. And it's all very well and good for you and I just to say we told you so. We did. But, you know, it can't fix it now unless you seriously make some choices.
I pick apart, you mentioned conscription though, out in Germany, and that seems to be a headline that people go, oh God, you know, scary, my son's going off to war and whatever. I do think it's worth illustrating that if you don't, we traditionally have invested in technology to stop us getting involved in wars of attrition. We had horrible memories of World War II, World War I. And a good example is control of the air. You know, if you look at Ukraine, Ukraine has not been able to control its own airspace. And as a result, it's been attacked from the air and the ground and has ended up getting dragged into a grueling war of attrition. If you look at what Israel did with Iran by actually controlling the airspace over Iran, it could fly its jets with impunity over Tehran. I do think we are an island nation. We've traditionally been air and maritime. That's what we traditionally have been. You go back to the Second World War, Battle of Britain, you know, we were fought almost to our last aircraft to protect the airspace over this country. And that stopped Hitler because Sea Lion was the, you know, the operation that was due to invade. And as a result of controlling the air, we stopped doing that. Therefore, the reason I'm rambling a bit is I think there is something about conscription. We don't want to have huge armies and get involved in the slaughter on the battlefields. We want to have credible military capability that deters any potential adversary. And control of the area, I think, is a really good example. We had 400 squadrons in World War II, nearly 100 involved in the Battle of Britain. We've now got less than 10. Now, I appreciate our modern aircraft are significantly more capable, but quantity does have a quality all of its own sometimes in these debates.
Yeah, and I think sometimes control of the air gets distilled down to almost like a Battle of Britain like argument, in that it's all about defending the nation's shores. You get control of the air to dominate the enemy. Now, you could argue that Ukraine is achieving some of that by being able to fire drones and these new missiles that it's developed into attacking refineries and some of those vulnerable points within Russia. And that is true. So Russia doesn't even have control of its own airspace, which is why Ukraine is able to keep striking deep targets. And it isn't about defeating an attack. It's about deterring that attack in the first place. And you don't just do that by having a really strong shield. And if you've just seen the Navy concepts that have just come out, Bastion, got to get them all right now, Atlantic Bastion, Atlantic Shield, and Atlantic Strike. Well, the one I want to hear about is Atlantic Strike. But if that's just about striking Russian naval assets, that's not enough, because that's defending an attack from Russia. What I really want to be talking about is how do we take the fight to Russia? How do you make a Russian act so costly for Russia that they won't even move? And I think that is the key for NATO and Europe. How do we become so capable of striking back that Russia cannot ever countenance trying to sneak a little bit of Estonia, because the cost to them will be too great. So we mustn't be too defensively minded, even though we are in a defensive alliance. The best form of defense, as they say, is attack. And I think we do need to make sure that we see both control of the air and our defensive posture in how quickly we would switch to the offensive, which would then allow us to push Russia back and make them realize that what they were doing is too costly. It's what Ukraine's trying to do, but is struggling with the resources it's got.
Oh, I agree. I mean, in a way, we've gone back to, you know, how do we up the ante for Ukraine? I mean, Russia put a whole load of drones that went into, you know, Poland, Romania, and flew 3 fighter jets through Estonian airspace. And we can make all the excuses we like, but the harsh reality is that when one Russian jet flew into Turkish airspace, you know, 10 years ago, Turkey shot it down. There was complete carnage diplomatically, but Turkey went, if you're going to fly your fighter jet, it's going to get shot down.
Yeah, yeah,
Russia never put a fighter jet back into Turkish airspace.
yeah.
All of these things are a test against our robustness and our resilience. And the one thing I violently agree with is, when one of the interviews I did this week, the interviewer said, "Oh, are we really threatened? Surely this is just the military people trying to get more money spent on defense again." And you went, right, two things. One of which is it's your fathers, it's your sons, it's your husbands and daughters that are going to fight. Surely you need to make sure they're as well prepared as possible for that act, since they're doing it on your behalf. And the harsh reality is, you and I both know that the best way to deter war is to prepare for it, so that your potential adversary is balancing the risks and the benefits and goes, do you know, it's just not worth it. At the moment, we are vulnerable. Russia knows we're vulnerable, and Europe is vulnerable as well. And the more we prevaricate around this, and rather than just getting on with it, get a plan out there, start funding it, and reap the consequences, I think we embolden Russia, and that's not good for any of us.
Well, that's definitely true, and therefore the unity is such a key part of this, which is why we've got to get better at sticking together. I think it was somewhat disingenuous for a lot of people took Rich Knighton's speech and focused on the sons and daughters bit and said, why am I going to put my sons and daughters into your ventures? Blah blah blah. It was quite a lot of right wing trolls pushing that particular, probably based in St. Petersburg, pushing that particular agenda. I don't think Rich was just referring to people in the military. And let's be honest, the sons and daughters dying in Kiev are dying in their flats or on the streets. War comes to you now. The idea that we go and fight foreign wars and our sons and daughters die hundreds of miles away, yes, there is some of that. But war comes to you now. That's the threat that we now face, with the ranges of missiles, with the sort of shall we say, completely abandoned attitude to the laws of our conflict that Russia demonstrates. War's coming to you. So if you don't spend the money now, if you don't commit to doing things now, your sons and daughters will be harmed, but so will you, and so will your property, because the war is going to come home. And that is quite an important factor here.
So I guess my sort of final thoughts on this are, do you think there is a threat from Russia? CDS talked about, it may only be less than 5%, but and he used the analogy, didn't he? Say there may only be a 5% chance of Liverpool winning the league this year, but there's still a chance. And therefore, there is a credible threat from Russia. I mean, I've heard people say, Russia's been, wounded. It's struggling just to make advance in Ukraine. Why should we be worried in these island nation? And what do you think? What's your sense?
The problem is when you try and be rational about this and you try and get your mind inside the head of your opposition, you do tend to think rationally. And rationally, it makes no sense whatsoever for Russia to take on NATO. We're nuclear equipped. We're going to end up getting to an escalation situation pretty quickly. We are not weak conventionally. As much as we talk about how poorly off we are with our stockpiles, NATO, even without America, is still a potent force. There's a question mark about how long it could fight for and whether it's even got the stomach for it. But we're still quite potent conventionally. So Russia is not, we're not going to be a pushover for Russia. Could Russia, however, do something below that threshold? Could they sneak a bit of the Baltic states? And I think that's the scenario that we all need to think through here, because what would our response be to that? Because it could probably happen quite quickly, and it would happen at a pace that we probably couldn't react fast enough to, and that the forces we have in being wouldn't be enough to stop it. Would then Russia maybe lob a couple of weapons into a couple of capital cities and Putin stare us down and say, do you want more of that? And suddenly we have a political uproar in European capitals and governments collapsing because nobody wants war coming to their doorstep. And Russia exploits that type of a reaction. I think that is where the danger lies. And you could argue that what Rich Knighton was warning us off against, Anne Alcairns, and head of MI6, Blaze, I forget her surname, was trying to get us to wake up to how we become resilient as a nation to that type of blackmail, as opposed to an all-out war. And so I think that is far more likely than the 4%, or whatever the figure was he gave in the end. Liverpool, I think, has blown it on the league. That's between you and me. So Yeah, I think there are scenarios where things could happen, things that are unimaginable probably to the many of the UK population walking to the shops today to go and buy their whatever for Christmas. The idea of a Russian cruise missile landing in Oxford Street is completely counter to any of their thoughts. But actually, could Russia utilize that type of an effect to get us to all suddenly, oh, don't do any more of that, Mr. Putin. You can have Estonia.
Well, it does sort of resonate that the whole, I think, out of sight, out of mind. You talked about wars of choice when we were going overseas, fighting a less than credible enemy, and tragically, people returning home injured or worse. I think it does. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we do the podcast, isn't it? It's because, it's not just generic. It's looking at specific capabilities through the war fighter's lens. Because as we speak at the moment, as we approach the Christmas break, our military, particularly our Royal Air Force, is guarding this nation 24/7 with quick reaction alert out of Coningsby and up the north, out of Lossiemouth. It's deployed in the Falkland Islands. It's deployed in Cyprus. It's deployed around the world. It's patrolling the skies on the east of NATO. It's also involved in chasing down ISIS. And I do think that professionalism, people don't often see it, but those are the brave men and women who are standing on the wall, who are being the most credible deterrents they can be. And it feels to me that they deserve our national support. And at the moment, they are not got the robustness, they haven't got the depth, they haven't got the credibility to actually fight a war of national survival. And that is something that feels like could be coming our way. We need to be better prepared.
Yeah, I thought you were about to do a quote then from A Few Good Men. You're going to do your best Jack Nicholson.
You can't handle the truth.
I did. I actually watched that clip just the other day. I mean, he obviously was in trouble for doing something else, but I think he said in the end, you can't handle the truth. I think what we've seen this week is a bit more of the truth. And it is therefore time to wake up. The problem is when you wake a population up to the stark reality of what that truth is, the next question is, what are you going to do about it? And that's the question that government is, let's be honest, failing to answer in a convincing way. And I think commentators like you and I, Sean, we walk the tightrope, don't we, from being, challenging when things aren't being done and when things are said that aren't necessarily so, as opposed to also being a cheerleader, because we don't want to undermine defence. We don't want to undermine the men and women who are out there, as you say, on the wall doing their daily job. So there's a really, and if you're trying to deter an enemy, then don't keep writing articles in your newspapers about how rubbish we are. That ain't helping. So there's a real balancing act here to be struck. And I feel for the government because I don't know, I'm not even sure what the right answer is, but we've now come clean. We've told the truth on the threat. And we've re-emphasized that this week. The next question is, what are you going to do about it? And I think we're all waiting with bated breath to see what the dip does or doesn't do to defence. But if we don't start seeing that money flow and things genuinely take a step up, there's some crumbs of comfort. We're seeing for the first time an uptick in recruitment. We're now seeing more in than out, which is something we haven't seen in a long, long time. So maybe there is a wake up out there. Maybe there is a younger generation who are seeing, the calling of a job in the military as something that is a noble cause, as you and I certainly did. But there's also dark and evil political forces out there who would try and argue the opposite. And many of those are really saying what Mr. Putin would want them to say.
No, I agree. And although it's a bit sombering, we'll go and spend Christmas now with families and relax and presents and eat and drink rather too much and, do a bit of DIY and all this sort of stuff. Having not that long ago returned from Ukraine, there is a war raging and it's not getting resolved anytime soon. And in fact, evidence suggests that Putin is upping the ante at the moment, doing almost a sort of final surge. And somehow we've just got to wake up to the fact that this is a European continent and it's coming our way. We need to be better prepared.
And I think it's good you circle back to Ukraine because our thoughts should be with them. That it's they ain't having much of a Christmas, obvious reasons, and haven't for some time now. When we start talking about will NATO give up a little bit of the Baltic states, of course we won't. That if we do, then Article 5 isn't worth the paper it's written on. But that's the fundamental question. Then, but can we give up a bit of the Donbass? Because if we do reward Putin's aggression, where does he go next? And if he thinks he can take an inch and then grab a mile, where else is he going to do that? Yeah, so they're really difficult and hard questions, and I think we've got to step up.
I think that's going to be the message for the new year, and be interesting to see how that plays out. But also getting our nation mobilized, both people, industry, defense industrial base. And let's face it, this isn't just for war. This is a great opportunity for growth into the export market. We've got some fantastic capabilities in this country. Let's do what the politicians said they were going to do and make that an engine for growth for the future. Everything else seems to be flatlining in this country. Let's get out there and capitalize, not only do it for our armed forces, but actually do it for our industry and our people as well. What a great opportunity. Greg, always been a pleasure. Hope you have a fantastic Christmas yourself, and look forward to continuing this story in the new year.
Yeah, you too, Sean, and a happy Christmas to all our listeners, all three of them, including yours and my mum.
Cheers, Greg.
Cheers, Sean.